Hello. Okay, we got the recording going. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our third panel at the 25th Annual Safe and Civil Schools National Conference. Thank you to all of you who are joining this session here today. And we're going to give, as we've done in the other sessions, just about a minute to let everybody kind of settle in, and then we'll get started introducing our topic for today, which is introducing our very exciting CHAMPS 3rd edition, new revision and discipline in the secondary classroom 4th edition. So we'll get started in just about a minute. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Sprick, for those of you who I have not had the opportunity to meet yet. I hope you are all having a wonderful conference, and thank you so much for being willing to come and spend a little bit of additional time, either learning about 2 new resources that maybe you haven't had as much exposure to in the past, and we'll be trying to provide an overview of general information about what these 2 resources are and what they can possibly do for you as a teacher or as someone who supports teachers. We also will be really just having a wonderful open discussion with the co-authors of these new resources on the revision and how we have tried to really move these forward into a new generation. So we're very, very excited today to be able to share these new resources with you that are, we got the discipline in the secondary classroom copies into the warehouse, I believe, like over the weekend. So this is a little bit of our launch process here. As I'm sure your presenters have been mentioning in other sessions, we would love to see you connecting with us over social media. So if you are a Twitter user at Safe and Civil and hashtag Safe and Civil Schools, also follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn, sharing favorite thoughts, photos, etc. Our panel format for today is we will be keeping this within an hour, and we will also be recording the session for anyone if you get pulled off and you need to view it at a later time. Do feel free to pose questions to our 3 co-authors today in the Q&A. There's also the chat box, and feel free to have some rich engagement and discussion with other folks that may be here with you, or if you'd like to pose questions about how people have used the CHAMPS and DSC resources in their schools or districts, feel free to be posing questions and having conversation in the chat box. Now, I am honored to introduce my wonderful, wonderful colleagues here and co-authors. Our panelists here today are Mr. Jacob Edwards, who is one of our Safe and Civil consultant extraordinaires. He always introduces himself as the new guy, but we are several years into a wonderful collaboration with Jacob. I think we need to take that title off of your docket. You are one of our most valued collaborators and messengers for getting this work out there across the country. We are so thankful for the input that Jacob provided and really providing us a lot of vision and guidance in some of the major conceptual pieces that we brought into this revision. We are so thankful for all of his experience. Jacob, could you speak a little bit, just introduce yourself, what your experience is as an educator and coming into Safe and Civil Schools? Not a new guy.
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm the new guy. No, so several years ago, I ran across Safe and Civil as a turnaround leader in Watts, California. And so kind of the organization I was a part of was trying to transform schools, close the equity gap. And so one of the things that really attracted me to Safe and Civil Schools was that we had a lot of competing initiatives at the time, or what was seemingly competing initiatives, and we needed to figure out how to organize and streamline things, right? So although I work in the behavior side, we're academic nerds, and I've worked in the Los Angeles area. If you've ever heard of Long Beach, Compton, Watts, and Inglewood, that's where I started my educational leadership journey. Yeah, and when Safe and Civil came and partnered with us, and so we've worked and turned around 4 schools that I've directly been a part of, 3 in Watts, California, 1 in the Memphis area where I live now, 2 of them middle schools and 2 of them high schools. And when we were looking for like our cultural approach. All of the approaches sound cute, but I wasn't sure if they could survive getting spit in the face or yelled at by a parent. It was a great theory, but I needed to know the practice. And so when I had my fantastic mentor, Susan Isaacs, come in over 14, 15 years ago, she helped me at each of our sites. And a few years ago, I joined the team to help advance the work and talk about not only integration, but how to make this great concept, these great tools practical. And work not only in rural environments and suburban environments, but also be battle tested in some of the toughest parts of our country. And so I'm so pleased to be here. I'm so great to be a collaborator. I'm inspired by not only the work of our consultants who are wonderful, but also by the schools and the districts who have inspired me to continue on this journey. So thank you so much, Jess. A little bit longer than the new guy this time, but that's kind of my spiel.
Thank you. We're gonna cross that off your job title description from this point forward, along with getting you to call Randy Randy and not Dr. Sprick. I don't think we'll ever be able to do it. All right, thank you, Jacob. Christy Coughlin, I'm going to give a brief introduction to you that I feel like in no way does justice to the incredible value that you bring to our organization at Safe and Civil Schools and Ancora Publishing. Christy is a PhD from University of Oregon in the area of school psychology. She is a self-professed research nerd who absolutely just loves digging into the research. And every time I ask her, you know, can you just like dig into this and tell me what you're finding? She gets excited about it, like going and pulling and finding those journals. So she is always helping us keep an eye on making sure that the things that we are taking out there and recommending to any educational professionals are grounded and based in the research and the evidence base. She also has just the most phenomenal way of keeping the heart of what we do very, very visible and evident, and helping us find ways to craft the wording of the resources that we put together to be reachable to folks and practical, while also really staying true to the robust practices and strategies that we put in place. I've had the honor to be co-authoring with Christy, and she's truly helped get us through some of our more difficult projects on bullying, on attendance, on interventions, early stage interventions. So we have a long-standing work relationship, and I just truly value you as a colleague and a co-author. Christy, can you give us a little other introduction to anything else you'd like us to know?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, likewise, it's just been such a great honor to be able to work with you, Jess, and everybody else on the team. And I was realizing that I've been with you guys for about 10 years now, and about 10 years ago, I was working on my dissertation, and that was about the same time that CHAMPS came out, the second edition. So it's been really, really enjoyable and fulfilling to be able to jump back into the research about classroom management effectiveness and find the things that have been consistent over time throughout all of the CHAMPS revisions. And yeah, it's just been really, really fun to be able to be on this project and continue to really bridge that research to practice gap and come up with strategies that are both evidence-based, but also easy to use and implement in classrooms. So thanks.
We so appreciate your voice in all of this and your willingness to join us here today. Just a brief introduction to myself. I am the daughter of Randy and Marilyn Sprick, and grew up obviously very much exposed to the field of education, but really got my start. I volunteered when I was an undergraduate in a middle school that had a full inclusion program for students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and found myself getting to work with one of the strongest teams that I have seen even since in trying to support students with intensive behaviors and emotional support needs. It was a phenomenal special education teacher, school psychologist, and counselor who all worked together to really try and figure out not just how to support the students themselves that were fully included in this program, but I think equally as important, finding ways to support the teachers, the general education teachers that were working with these students in effective management strategies. And so I really was able to see the potential of what can happen when good practices are put in place, and how even those students who might seem the farthest out of our reach are able to achieve high levels of behavioral and academic success. I did run a semi-self-contained program for middle school students with behavioral disorders, where I was transitioning students from residential and day treatment facilities and trying to reintegrate them back into the general education school population. My classroom was kind of the point place where we tried to create a sense of stability and be able to figure out what their academic and social needs were before we threw them out into the fold of the 1,000 or so middle school students that we had. And what I found is that I used CHAMPS on steroids for my students. You know, when you've got a classroom of students who all have high needs, it's not a different approach. It's not something separate from what we have in these resources. It is everything that is in these resources, and you're figuring out the way to do them with the highest levels of structure, the highest levels of support. And so I was very, very honored when Randy, my dad, who has been the lead author on the previous versions of this resource, asked if I would take the lead in guiding this wonderful team that we have here, as well as Randy Sprick. He was integrally involved in all of the planning with this resource and reviewing all of the recommendations at each step of the way that, you know, Christy, Jacob, and I were coming up with. And we were going to him and saying, you know, is it workable? Does it make sense? Is it honoring everything that he had built in the past? Randy is not able to join us here today, but he does send his greetings, and we're all very, very excited to be building off of the amazing foundation that he has given us with these two wonderful resources. Now, for those of you who are a little bit newer to CHAMPS and discipline in the secondary classroom, maybe you've heard about them in some of your sessions, or you've been in a district where you've heard of some people using this approach, but you're not as familiar with it yourself. We wanted to just start with a real quick framing of what these resources are and where they fall within the continuum of a multi-tiered system of support, and also within the continuum of the MTSS approach that we at Safe and Civil Schools have, both from a PD perspective and the book resources that we have available, but also just the range of different things that we work with schools and districts on. So CHAMPS and discipline in the secondary classroom, if you see DSC, that's just referring to our high school version. CHAMPS is primarily a resource that's geared through kindergarten through 8th grade, or pre-K through 8th grade. Discipline in the secondary classroom, actually one of the main things that we did in the revision of DSC is we created far more alignment and consistency between CHAMPS and DSC. So you're actually going to find that these resources are not that much different. But we did want to have a resource that was specific to high school teachers, 9th through 12th grade, partially just because we know you've got some educators who will look at a resource if they are a 11th grade high school teacher and they see a kindergarten example within a book and they go, that's not for me, right? So all of the base of the strategies are very, very much aligned. There's a lot of similarity between these two resources, but we did gear a little bit more advanced strategies and definitely a more advanced look for the discipline in the secondary classroom 9 through 12 resource. So these two resources are basically designed to help provide a guide or a problem-solving approach for teachers and then any staff who support teachers, administrators, coaches, counselors, et cetera, to ways that you can use a positive, proactive, and instructional approach to the way that you manage student behavior and provide supports for behavior in ways that help all students thrive. When you think about this in terms of a continuum of supports, notice that where the arrow is pointing, positive classroom management, we do have that sitting as a tier 1 strategy. So if you look at the right side of this triangle here, you can see that everything that we have down at the bottom, which we would call our school-wide foundations approach, you know, a lot of people term it PBIS, positive behavioral interventions and supports, or your school-wide climate and safety efforts. Addressing things like common areas and policies, looking at school-wide data to try and identify trends, ways that you are creating an invitational climate for your families and broader community. That these are all school-wide approaches, but we also have tier 1 at the classroom level. And what we have found is that even schools that do a very, very good job with the foundational parts of tier 1 at that school-wide level, classrooms are so idiosyncratic and they are so specific to each individual teacher's subject, the specific mix of students that they have within that class, and each teacher's own personal preferences, that simply knowing how to do positive and instructional approaches at that school-wide level doesn't always translate into the classroom without a real specific focus. And so that's a big part of what the focus of CHAMPS and DSC is to say, how do we take good, effective management approaches and find specific ways to apply them at that classroom level? We're looking at practical, feasible strategies, so hopefully nothing that is too complicated, and really helping empower teachers to be active problem solvers, where they're pre-correcting for as many possible problems as they can anticipate, and from year to year saying, how do I get a little bit better at tightening my procedures, at thinking through ways that I can reorganize the classroom or more clearly teach my expectations. But also, if there are any problems that occurred during the course of the school year where we start seeing that student motivation or turning in work or things like certain types of transitions or activities are not as effective as I personally as a teacher want them to be, or as we are hoping to achieve according to certain data metrics, that I am able to actively problem solve. And I have a toolkit or a compendium of a bunch of different resources and ways that I can make tweaks and adjustments in my classroom. So that's kind of my overview of what this resource is. Jacob and Christy, please feel free to add anything as we're hoping to introduce people to these resources.
Well, I'll just jump in and speak a little bit about the research part. If we have a second. One of my favorite things about this book is that every single time that there's a revision done, we check to see if the research has been consistent, and then we adjust based on new information. And it's just so valuable to see that all of the structural components that are part of every single version of CHAMPS are just continuing the seminal research that we know about what works in classrooms. And it's really fun to dive back into that and then see some of the emerging trends that come out about things that are happening in classrooms. And when we don't have clear information about, you know, a robust literature base on new stuff. So I'm thinking, for example, one of the things we included in this version of CHAMPS was some discussion about flexible seating. And so flexible seating is a practice that's been used more and more in classrooms, where students are able to choose their own seats. And those seats might be something like a couch instead of a desk and chair, or one of those stability balls. And there is some research about how those types of seating practices might be good for students with ADHD or ASD, but there isn't enough research to say that this is the best practice to incorporate class-wide. And so in this version of CHAMPS, we kind of talk a little bit about that research without recommending that as a practice, and then kind of walk readers through the process of making some of the decisions that would require teachers to think about how that might be feasible or not in their classroom. So it's cool to be able to bring in new pieces of research and, you know, talk about them in a way that says that this isn't something that we recommend that you need to do, but if you want to think about this, then here's where the research is, and here's how you might think about ways of incorporating that in the classroom.
And Christy, that's I think that's one of the things that you know, your comment is something that we're very proud of, is that you know, CHAMPS and DSC are not dictatorial approaches. They're not saying you have to do everything exactly this way, or we have to walk into classrooms and these are the exact, you know, we're marking check boxes off to say, you know, this person is doing these things. We do have some things that we know are strongly recommended. So, you know, the research base consistently supports that you need to have a clear attention signal, and that there are some hallmarks for what that attention signal might look like and how much time it should take, right? And so we can provide some real clear recommendations on that. But when we see something like flexible seating, where we're seeing a trend, and I'm seeing this as very regional. Some places I go are not at all jumping on this flexible seating bandwagon, and other places are, like, I'm hearing some people saying every classroom needs to have a flexible seating arrangement, and here's what that has to look like. What we are saying when we encounter a trend like that is, we don't have clear research at this point, but here's some pros and cons and considerations if you are going to try it, in some ways that it could make it more successful, and possibly some times where you might say this is not going to be the best arrangement for the health of my students and the productivity of the class. So really appreciate you bringing that conceptualization forward. Jacob, did you have anything you'd like to add before we move into organization?
No, not at this time.
Okay, great. So I'm going to stop my share here. And what Jacob, Christy, and I were kind of hoping to accomplish here is we want to give a sense of what the new organization of CHAMPS is, so that for any of you who are diving into this resource, you've got a little bit of a roadmap for where it's going. I think all of us have our sort of favorite pieces that we just are near and dear to our heart in this new revision that we might want to speak about. And we also really want to make sure that we highlight, for those of you who are doing other aspects of work with safe and civil schools, where we've tried to create a lot more intentional alignment between different resources. And so we're, people who are doing foundations and CHAMPS implementations see where that crossover, where that alignment is. For people who are using coaching classroom management and CHAMPS, that we're really creating that intentional alignment. So let's just start with organization, and I'll just kick it off by mentioning kind of the major way that we've reorganized the content. So the previous edition of CHAMPS was organized around 5 big sections, which were aligned with our STOIC acronyms: structure for success, teach expectations, observe and monitor, interact positively with students, and correct fluently. And what we basically did with this version is we started out with a first section that is really about vision. How is this work fitting or aligning with other initiatives that you have in place, looking at some critical components. So in a moment, Jacob, since I know you did so much of the work on this, I want us to kind of talk through what some of those critical pieces are that we brought into that initial task with vision. There is a section on understanding how to shape behavior. That task is actually very similar to what we had in the previous edition. But we also, for those of you who are deeply familiar with CHAMPS and discipline in the secondary classroom, we moved the classroom management plan up into the first chapter so that really the CMP can guide all of the decisions that are coming afterwards. The classroom management plan, we find all of us at Safe and Civil Schools really use that as a guide during training. It's kind of like, here's some of the big considerations, and we're going to work through lots of different STOIC variables, but you're filling out your classroom management plan as you go. We do even have schools where there's an expectation where all teachers are submitting the CMP to their instructional coach and their building leader, so that that's just on hand. As if a teacher is saying, I'm really struggling with this thing, we can go back to that document and say, okay, here's what you had at the beginning of the year. How do you make tweaks and changes to that? So we felt that was really important to pull up into this first section. The second section is the bulk of the CHAMPS book. It is chapters 2 through, I think, 9, if I'm speaking correctly from our outline. And those are the STOIC chapters. So we have 2 chapters on structure. We separate it out. It's a little bit of a false distinction, but into some of the structural behavioral decisions, things like the organization of your classroom, things like how you organize transitions, and so on, and then instructional decisions. And so that second STOIC chapter is related to your expectations for cooperative group work and independent work, how you schedule your time periods during an individual period or across the course of the day. We also included a fairly robust section and brought in a wonderful collaborating author, contributing author, Jeremy Resnick, who was a former curriculum director in Ventura County, to work on a section about understanding pros and cons of certain grading practices. So we've got a fairly robust section now in that chapter on grading. Moving into the T, the O of STOIC, we have 1 chapter on each of those: teach and observe. 2 chapters on interacting positively, and then 1 chapter on correcting misbehavior fluently. So that's the second section of our organization. Third section is where we talked about ongoing implementation and maintenance. So once you have designed your classroom management plan, what does it take to launch that in the first few weeks of school? And then how do you use data and other tools across time to be evaluating, is this classroom management plan working the way that I intended to try and meet my vision? Now, if you receive the book and you're going, oh my goodness, this was already a large book and it is now grown. So I'm going to hold it up for all of you. The spine is fairly thick. take a moment not to panic, because a big part of that growth in both CHAMPS and discipline in the secondary classroom is we did add about 100 pages on applying CHAMPS or applying discipline in the secondary classroom approaches in the virtual learning environment. So that whole fourth section, which is just one chapter, it basically takes all of the previous work that we had done in laying a foundation for building your classroom management plan. How do you take those same strategies and repurpose them when you are on a Zoom meeting or a Google Meets or something like that? So that's kind of our general organization. Anything to add, co-authors? Okay, so let's dive into some favorites. Let's talk some of our new strategies, new things that we brought in. Jacob, I'm going to throw it to you.
Absolutely. One of my most favorite things about this project that we worked on was I really think that not only did we honor the research, we honored our previous track record and what we put in the book. We honored our consultants, past and present. I think this was a celebration of what we've learned over the years. And we were able to really articulate that. And so you know, as we were writing this, we were thinking about all those lessons learned and how we approach it. What was really cool is that attracted me to Safe and Civil as a client, but now as a consultant, was that there were very few rules. Say again?
I said, and an author.
And come on now, hello, put that on me. I'm an author now. But what I'm saying is that we have very few rules. The only golden rule I remember was dignity and respect is at the forefront of every interaction, or else, you know, belittlement has no place in any educator's repertoire, right? That was one stake in the ground, because we were also honoring what the educator brought to the table. What I'm really excited and proud about our organization was really in our beginning of our chapter, where we were able to call out some bedrock principles or some assumptions we had about our district and state collaborating partners, right? These were some assumptions that were going in, and I was really proud to help capture what we believe that everyone, all effective teachers who are really in this for the right reasons. And that's our assumption walking in. I was glad and proud that we called it out. As an administrator, it would have been very helpful if I was able to identify some of these practices and mindsets that effective staff would have, that transcends all socioeconomic status and populations. And so I really loved our intro to CHAMPS, where we not only talked about how this integrates with other initiatives that are powerful, but we also talked about, like, you know, specifically existing regularities, which is unknown passed down histories and how that could be harmful in a practice, or how to use data, how to integrate diversity, equity, and access. And we also, it's really weird for me, because about a year ago, we had a panel on diversity, equity, and access, and to see how it wasn't just a conversation, but we were able to, within a year, integrate, call out, and explicitly talk about if we have a mission, right, in our schools to educate all children. We're talking about all. Those who are homogeneous populations, heterogeneous populations. It's really amazing to be part of a team to bring that and honor that in written text. And where do we believe, and what is our perspective on Safe and Civil? So, you know, mission beliefs, those guardrails, as you mentioned, you and Dr. Archer mentioned in the keynote. I think that chapter 1 is all about setting up some of these guardrails and some of these bedrock principles that we all need to bring to the table.
And Jacob, I really am glad that you highlighted that, because I think that's also, for me, one of the things that I feel very, very proud about, both as an organization, but also just in the writing of this book, is that I think we purposely went a little less position neutral in really trying to frame that our purpose as educators has to be fighting for all of our kids, and that we know that we have some kids that we have to fight more for. And that, you know, in looking at those guiding principles and looking at the ways that we, you know, as you mentioned, diversity, equity, inclusion, and access is one section that we call out at the beginning, that we say it's a cornerstone commitment. It's something that we expect all educators to, if you're using this book, you have to be committed to that, and that expectation is running through that. as you're looking at existing regularities, and Jacob mentioned existing regularities, I want to define that a little bit more. Those are those practices that just because we've done them the way we've always done them is not the way that it has to be. And so whether it is something, like the way we've taken attendance or the way that we've done our seating arrangements or things like that, that if we haven't questioned those in relationship to, are they helping us meet our mission and our vision statement, then we are potentially leaving some students behind. And so I think that those considerations, as we moved into chapters 2 through 9, and then especially chapter 10, which is on, evaluating how it's going in your classroom, that we're really trying to call out that you have to be intentional in being considerate about what you're putting into your classroom, especially for those learners that may have the most vulnerabilities if we're not being conscious of that.
Jess, I like to think of chapter 1 when we included the concept of relational trust and how that's parallel, but kind of pulled out of the I in the Stoic framework and the Stoic framework itself. Think of it as kind of a roadmap of reoccurring themes that we're going to call back throughout the rest of the chapter, right? And so what was very hard for me as a newer admin was trying to figure out how to take all of these good practices and to make it into a practical approach. And I think that I'm very proud of this book, how we talked about these theoretical underpinnings, the research, the Stoic framework, and all of these topics. But we explicitly, and I think that added to the length of this, is after we had you think of a new concept or we introduced a certain element, if it related to one of these bedrock principles, we talked about the practical application. And so now I feel like this book is it was already a wonderful resource. It still is, the previous edition. It goes even deeper to allow this to be a self-study of an individual educator. Because we're talking about all these other considerations, not prescriptive, but hey, if this is an issue on your campus, this might be how you apply this with this lens. I'm very proud of that work that we were able to do, not only with this writing team, but I can't emphasize enough how our consulting partners, how our district learnings, and how the research has influenced what we put in here. To some degree, yes, I'm an author, but I feel like I'm more of a facilitator and a cultural historian, if you will.
And honoring and sharing those successes
exactly.
with all of those collaborating partners that we've had the great fortune to work with across all these.
Exactly.
Years. Yeah. Christy, I'm going to turn it to you to either expand on what we were just talking about or dive into some of your favorites.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of my favorite parts are similar. I really love how we were able to kind of backtrack and talk about the core principles that are really prevalent in CHAMPS, but everything that Safe and Civil Schools does. And I like having those kind of key ideas and critical concepts as we think about all of our products and how everything works together. But I would say probably my favorite part about this version of CHAMPS is just that emphasis on relational trust and some of those specific strategies and relationship building. And I think as the research comes out and talks about just how important teacher-student relationships and that relational trust is to behavior and academics, to really have a tangible amount of information in that book about how to build those relationships and what that looks like and how you there's potential to break that relational trust in different strategies that we use in the classroom. So I think just having that be a lot more overt. I know that when I've been participating in some of our amazing trainers' professional development sessions, there's always so much emphasis on that in the professional development sessions, but to actually have that in our book in such a overt way is really exciting for me.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, just thinking about that issue of relational trust, that I'm very, very excited that we pulled more of a focus into is the previous edition of CHAMPS had one task that was really focused on family interaction, family engagement. And in the classroom management plan, we now actually have a section on how to apply thinking about positive interactions, how to interact with families related to corrective interactions, how to share data with families. So we very much increased the focus on we as teachers need to be intentional in the way that we're thinking about how we are either drawing our families in as partners and collaborators, or potentially creating a barrier or some adversarial interaction. And I think that one for me is just so important because I worked with so many families in my, especially my classroom setting, who just felt so disillusioned from years of adversarial interactions with the school system, with educators assuming the worst about them as parents, assuming that they didn't care about their kids, when the reality was they all cared desperately for their kids and the success of their students, but they didn't know what else to do. That some of these strategies, like intentionally thinking about, are we maintaining positive ratios of interactions with our families, not just our kids, that we can't just call on them when we have a behavioral concern. And when we do, we have to be real considerate about the way that we frame that, so that, again, we're trying to keep those avenues of partnership open. I'm very excited and proud of that addition that we have in there.
You know what's really cool about this resource, although I know it was years in the making, I'm so proud of the timing and the relevance. We're all going back into a situation where our schools are going back almost near capacity, full capacity. And to really think about these things and how we call things out in the first, talking about those basics, bedrock principles. I think a lot of our schools across the nation are going back to the basics as they try to meet the needs of not only their students, but their teachers and also their parents. So I think that this is super relevant. I remember when we were trying to target and release this earlier, we would have never had an opportunity to include such a robust virtual a section. And so that's something I'm proud of, is although it wasn't as designed as I would have thought, I think it's super relevant and super powerful to have this resource before we go back into the new school year. So.
It was interesting as we were working on the virtual section, because we went round and round and round about, like, okay, is this a different resource? Is it the same resource and we're just adding a few sections? We really struggled with how to organize that. And what we ended up really finding is, many of the tasks that are within each chapter of CHAMPS are applicable as is, right? You need to be building positive relationships with your kids and giving them positive interactions, right? That's true in a virtual, it's true in a face-to-face learning environment. You may have to be a little bit more intentional about it when you're in the virtual setting, if it comes naturally to do this in an in-person learning environment. We did find that there were many strategies that were very applicable from traditional CHAMPS, but you might just have to make some tweaks or additional considerations for how to apply it in the virtual. So, for example, the acronym CHAMPS, for those of you who are not aware of it, is actually related to how you clarify your expectations for each activity or each transition in your classroom. So you're trying to help define, in teacher-directed instruction as compared to a small group activity, the expectations for conversation are very, very different, right? Most teachers would say in teacher-directed instruction, you're supposed to be listening to the teacher, probably a 0 voice level, but some teachers are a little bit looser with that. If you have a quiet on-topic conversation for less than a minute, that's okay. But in small group instruction, we're saying conversation, yes, talk to each other, right? But we need to define what that looks and sounds like. The H in CHAMPS is for help. How are students getting help from you or from others if they're needing it? The A is for activity. What are we doing? What are the outcomes? M is movement. So this really gets to, is it okay to get out of your seat and sharpen your pencil? Is it okay to go get a drink of water? Do you need permission to do those things? And then participation. What does participation look and sound like? What we found is that that's still very applicable in the virtual learning environment, but there are some slight tweaks and adaptations. So if you are going to have that visually posted, how are you doing that? Are you like putting a poster right behind you here? Are you posting something on a slide on the screen? Jacob, all of the different ways that can go. And so many of the tasks we took, we just said, read the original task and consider how you would apply this. And then here's some additional considerations for the virtual environment. We actually found that there were only a few tasks that needed to either be completely abandoned. So physical structure of your classroom in a virtual environment, probably not as important to be considerate about, how students are at their desk arrangements. But we do provide information on how you can help kids and families have a productive learning environment at home. So for example, we used the example that came from one of the groups that I worked with in Oregon, where they found that when they've sent home trifold science boards to kids so that kids could have like a protected cubby workspace. So if there's 3 kids sitting at a dining table, they all had their little protected workspace that they're working behind. They were able to significantly increase the engagement and the attention of the students during those activities. So those are some of the things that we tried to really bring into that virtual learning chapter, which is why we did decide to keep it within the CHAMPS book. It just made our page count a little bit longer. So shipping costs are higher, so we had to send them out to folks. Jacob, I know you mentioned when we were talking about this up front, you really wanted us to make sure that we highlighted alignment with our other resources. So can I kick that off to you to speak to about?
Yes, and in this version, I think there's some direct overt integration between different resources we offer. So like, when we talk about data, we do a nod to our foundations process where we talk about the improvement cycle, right? And so I think that's powerful because if you're here in this webinar, you might have come to our conference in different sections and you don't even know what CHAMPS or DSE is. But as you read through it, you'll see that when appropriate, we'll call out how this relates to our coaching resource, right? Or how this relates to our leadership and behavior supports, or how does this relate to school-wide? Oftentimes we have people to confuse why school-wide PBIS as a replacement for good classroom management plans. You'll be surprised at how many people think that they can hand out reinforcement tickets and that's a replacement for structuring, right? And so we explicitly clarify that this is the resource that will address that, but this is the direct into, because we know that different schools are in different places. And so we wanted to make sure that we honored that work as well.
Christy, you have been integral in helping us rework the interventions resources that we previously had, which have now all also been reorganized. So maybe you and I can talk a little bit about how previous editions of CHAMPS and interventions have now turned into a couple of different resources, some of which have the same names and some are different.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was thinking about some of the differences between the second edition of CHAMPS and this current one, one of the big things that jumped out to me is the content that we've put into the early stage interventions book, which is actually a new resource for us, because previously we had some of that individual intervention design guidance in CHAMPS, but now we have a separate resource. So CHAMPS is really that universal classroom management planning. And then once you need to get past that to help support individual students that classroom management plan might not be robust enough to support, then we have another resource that starts talking a little bit about those early stage interventions that you can use. So I really like that that linear direction of how our resources have been restructured and how they fit into that diagram that you showed at the beginning of this webinar.
Yeah, and that was, I was reflecting on what was some of the reason that we made some of those changes. So for those of you who are deeply familiar with our second edition of CHAMPS, third edition of DSC, the final chapter of those resources, which was titled, I believe, Correcting, was really focused on how do you take similar thinking and approaches and start to individualize it for you've got your basic management plan that is your approach to try and pre-correct for as many issues as you can, but you've got a student or a couple of students who are starting to exhibit some chronic misbehavior concerns. And what we realized is that, that almost needed to become a different resource, because CHAMPS itself, the classroom management plan and all of the things that go into it, if we were going to better expand on a few things, and Christy, in a little bit, I'm going to want you to talk about the additions that we made for instructional activities. because I think that's a real cool part of this new edition, that if we were going to really be able to expand into some of that, we needed to buy ourselves a little bit of currency and resource page count wise, but also almost framing it as like, you need all of these things in place with CHAMPS or discipline in the secondary classroom to have a good tier 1 base of your management. But then there's also some easy, simple interventions and early stage interventions. We actually debated calling it CHAMPS Volume 2 to try and emphasize that these really work together and they are a little bit of a continuum. You've got your good base of management in place that's working for 90 to 95% of your kids. Now, how do you have some easy, simple classroom-based interventions? And I believe we have 7 interventions in that resource that align very closely with many of the strategies, but now you're bringing more focus and intention and function-based thinking. So trying to get that understanding of what are the causes of this individual student's failure to respond the way we would hope they would in the CHAMPS approach. Those two work so nicely together. And so we really wanted to have these 2 classroom-based resources. I could very easily see in some districts, like year 1, we are focusing primarily on CHAMPS. Year 2, we're starting to deepen into CHAMPS, but we're also now starting to pull in some of those early stage resources if you were looking at a sequence for kind of how to roll that out for teachers. Anything else to add with that, Christy and Jacob?
I don't think so, no.
The only thing, and I know if I was here in the webinar, I would like, man, this is a great resource for teachers. And if you're a teacher, you can use it as is. But I think that I would be remiss if I don't throw a nod to really, how do you support this? This is great classroom management strategies. I think you highlighted even in the keynote, but we also need to think about how do you continue and support it with coaching and through the leadership decisions, right? And so one of the powerful things about this, but not for it to be missed, is that this resource was written towards the primary audience was a teacher, right? Oftentimes I see this used for leaders, and it's a great resource to know what your teachers are knowing, but this was the target audience was primarily the teacher. What are we doing for coaching? What are we doing about the leaders? That would be it.
Great, thank you, Jacob. So Christy, now I'd like for you to speak a little bit to the amazing groundwork that you did. Something that always just felt a little bit uncomfortable to me with the previous edition of CHAMPS was that there was this great task in chapter 2 on managing independent work periods. And it talked about, you know, how do you change possibly your help signal, which during teacher directed instruction, it's just fine if you're asking a question and it's this, but when you're in independent work, if a kid is doing this, they're not working on their independent work, right? And so it provides all of these great suggestions for how you might need to tweak your help signal. You know, the example of turning a book up on your desk. So that's a sign to the teacher that they might need help. Raising your hand, and the teacher is going to have a signal so that they can tell you to put your hand down and keep working. And the teacher is going to write your name down on a list so that they can make sure they can go to each of those kids. I loved that section. It was so concrete, so practical. And I always went, why don't we have that for teacher directed instruction and cooperative group work? It's like, we need that. And my dad, when I asked him about it, he said basically he just ran out of time and didn't include it in there. So I do think one of the exciting things about this edition is I believe it's in our 3rd chapter. We now have a section, a task on teacher-directed instruction, recommendations for how you can structure your CHAMPS expectations for teacher-directed activities, having considerations of if it's a classroom that needs high levels of support, so lots of orchestration from the teacher, lots of very clear kind of tight expectations as compared to, you know, we have those classrooms where you can say, kind of, you know, manage yourselves and the kids are able to do it. We have a section for that for independent work, teacher-directed instruction, and now cooperative group activities. And Christy, you were so foundational in us being able to craft those sections and looking into the research. Why don't you speak a little bit to some of what we brought in for cooperative group activities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what was pretty exciting about that new section too was there was a little bit of content in the 2nd edition about good instructional practices, but until you sort of divide those out into what the instructional activity looks like, whether it's pair group work or pair work, group work, independent work. So it was pretty nice to be able to bring in some of the research on good instructional practices for different types of activities, and to do it in a way that is actually right in the process of defining your expectations for each of those activities too. So I think we were able to cover a lot more without it being a little bit too overwhelming, and also be able to just integrate some of those best practices and instruction into your behavior support plan management stuff. So yeah, the cooperative work was actually really interesting for me. I don't have a lot of my background is more in the direct instruction world. So cooperative work activities and some of the research about how you group students appropriately and some of the considerations you have to think about for English language learners, for example, was really interesting and pretty fun to be able to work that into that chapter.
And so Christy does this phenomenal job of taking, you know, all of this different research and saying, like, here's where we've got some pretty solid evidence from lots of meta-analyses and lots of studies that have come together and kind of confirmed the same thing. Here's where we've got some sort of inconclusive findings. But really pulling them into very practical strategies. So like something that I took from that cooperative work section is, you know, you can have cooperative group activities that are for different purposes, and that should really dictate the type of grouping that you look at. So you can create homogeneous groups, heterogeneous groups, you can create random groupings, and each of those structures has different times when you might apply them. So we've got some examples in there. Christy was able to help us identify that, you know, the research is really indicating that groups of 3 to 6 are probably optimal, but that the smaller the group is, the more it's gonna create, what is it called? Positive interdependence, is that what the term is? Where kids are really, every student is having to contribute. So the larger the group size is, the more easy it is for us to have that sort of inequitable structure where a couple of kids are like, we got it, and we're moving it forward, and other students are falling back. But even in thinking about those larger groups, how do you create things like very clear job roles, rubrics for expectations? I just feel like some of the concrete pieces that are in there, I know Trisha Skiles, one of our consultants, was like, we could do like whole trainings on just this section. And so I think it's just a very exciting addition that adds a lot of practical strength to, we are advocating you should have all of these different types of activities in your classroom: independent activities, teacher directed activities, and cooperative ones, which includes partner and small group work. So you have to be considerate in how you're implementing those. So I just want to give huge kudos to you for really helping us make that a reality.
It's an exciting addition. I completely agree.
Jacob, before we close, I also think that for folks who are very familiar with the resource in the past, one of the things that may be quite different in this version is analyzing the level of support and how we were intentional in changing the name of that. So previously, those of you who are familiar with the previous editions of CHAMPS, we had some resources that were asking you to sort of self-evaluate your own need for structure in the classroom and your students' needs for structure. Jacob was absolutely integral in helping us shift that from the term structure to levels of support. And I want you to describe kind of what our thought process was in making that very intentional change.
Absolutely. You stole the next line. Okay. We talked about level of supports, and we were trying to get away from level of structure, because what that implied sometimes is, if I find out after this survey, and I think you described it well, it's an inventory type survey where you look at your personal preferences and you honor what you bring to the table. Then you also assess your student needs, and you get these numbers. You compare these numbers, and it would recommend that your environment, based upon your preference and your student needs, we would say you're more likely a high structure, a medium structure, or a low structure type of environment. Well, what would happen unintentionally is some people thought that I don't need to have all of these structures in place if I'm low structure. And when that's not what we meant at all, you still need to consider all of these decisions. And that's also why we adopted the language of decisions, because really the structures come in two phases, right? Let's first make a decision, and then build physical structures or complementary structures to bolster it and to communicate it, right? And so you still need to consider all of these decisions, but the way that you're going to orchestrate it is going to depending upon the level of support your environment needs, not the level of structure. And so it was in the name structure. It was before we called out decisions, but that's why we were very intentional about shifting it from levels of support to level of structure, or level of structure to level of support.
Jacob, another thing that I felt as we were having this discussion was really revelatory for me, is that by labeling it level of structure, people were bringing that intentionality about thinking like, I have a group that has high needs. I've got lots of students who have experiences of trauma. I've got lots of students who have significant stressors at home. I've got lots of kids who, struggle to manage their own bodies or to follow expectations or whatever it is. That when we are making the term high structure, we're sort of pigeonholing it to the chapters that are on structure. But if you think about it, like interacting positively, if you have a classroom that has high needs, you should be bringing positive interactions in any environment. But when you've got students who have high needs, there needs to be more intentionality, more focus, more direct emphasis on I have to work intentionally with each of these kids to build that relational trust, because they may not have it, right? I need to work much more carefully to think about, I think about my students, many of whom had experiences of physical or sexual abuse. When I'm giving them corrective interactions, I need to be much more conscious about the level of support that I give when I'm giving those corrective interactions, that I don't come from behind them, because that's very physically triggering to those students. And so I think by reframing it, we're really making it saying that, if you have a classroom that needs high support, you've just got to be much more careful in the considerations that you put into the management plan, but that's across all of the STOIC variables. So I want to thank you for really helping us with that terminology.
Agree.
All right. So, we are getting rapidly to the close of our time together. I just want to open it up. Jacob and Christy, do either of you have anything else you'd like to add before we kind of remind people about tomorrow's panel and close off for the day?
Nothing for me.
Nothing that won't get us started for another hour. So I'm satisfied.
Well, it has been an absolute honor and a privilege to work with you, both of you, on this. And I know that Randy is incredibly proud of the resource. And I have to admit, I was showing a lot of productive procrastination behaviors at the outset of trying this product, where I was finding every other thing that I could work on that I could give myself the excuse that I was being productive, because it was a very daunting task. I don't know if the two of you felt this, to take such a phenomenal and well-respected resource from the second edition of CHAMPS and the third edition of DSC and try to figure out how to make it better. But I think that our collaboration has been very effective in just moving this into a new era. So thank you to all of you participants who are still with us here today. We do have one more panel tomorrow, which is going to be kind of just a summary, putting it all together panel with Anita Archer. I do have to mention yesterday, I forgot to say that it's Dr. Anita Archer, Dr. Trisha Berg. I left off my dear colleague's PhD credentials there. I was called out by somebody, not Trisha. Dr. Trisha Berg and Dr. Caitlin Milliken. I'm working on mine. I'm just not there yet. So I'm the baby of the group in this crowd. We are going to pay a little bit more of a focus and intention around attendance and engagement tomorrow, but we will be trying to weave in behavior and academic success as well. So thank you to all of you. We look forward to seeing you in your primary sessions tomorrow, and hope that you have a fantastic evening. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for another great panel. I enjoyed. Can't wait to get the books and read both of them. So thank you, thank you, thank you. I'll learn a lot.
Your books are on the way, Anita. They should be arriving today.
Excellent. Well, then they'll be read tonight. So thank you, and for the really work you put into some excellent references, because too many theoretical books on behavior, not enough on what to do, or what to do that isn't research validated. So it's really important what you've done, the work you've done. So I'm going to encourage many schools to get either or both. Yeah. All right. Thanks for letting me hang out with the panel.
It's great to see you, Anita. We'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Nick, I'll see you early tomorrow. Jacob, have a great time with your group. Bye-bye.
Jess and Jacob,